Reading Marvel's Thor might be a good introduction to Norse mythology, but that might not be the best choice for understanding Norse mythology. Many superheroes throughout Marvel and DC Comics draw heavily from ancient mythology, from Wonder Woman and the Amazons, from Themyscira, to Asgardians and Thor, to Shazam. Mythology offers this common culture that you can lift from, that most people are kind of familiar with. But they might not know it intimately, and that allows writers to exercise some creativity with how they incorporate myth. After all, the average person is barely familiar with the canon of folklore and religion of the modern day. How can they really know all about folklore from thousands and thousands of years ago? Yet people online seem to be self-proclaimed experts on mythology, on culture, and they can tell you, hey, this adheres to the myth, this is different, etc. Well, there's a problem with that, though. When discussing religious canon of yesteryear and ancient civilizations, the question of what's canon comes up. It might be a little harder than you think to determine what is canon. After all, thousands of years of oral traditions, political rewrites, and just plain changing cultures make mythology into this more organic thing. Add to that, our modern understanding of ancient mythology is based on surviving poems, theatrical productions, and documents from thousands of years ago. Things get murky. Don't forget, we only just discovered how to read hieroglyphics within the last couple of centuries, meaning that Egyptian mythology was pretty much unknown to us for many, many, many centuries. Musical nerds might question whether or not Hades Town or Epic the Musical are accurate depictions of the story of Orpheus and Odysseus, but you have to remember that your understanding of both Orpheus and Odysseus are based on the stories that survive to the modern day. Odysseus specifically, we know about Odysseus thanks to the Odyssey and the Iliad, two epic poems by Homer, which themselves were part of a 6-part cycle of epics, of which 4 are now lost forever. We know what was in them generally because they're based on pre-existing myths from oral tradition, but we don't have the original texts. Mythology is an organic thing, and some of it dies, and some of it grows, and some of it substitutes and replaces itself in the modern era. So how can we determine if DC and Marvel are accurate depictions of mythology when we don't even understand what the traditions that were believed at the time were? To help with this fairly complicated topic, I reached out to someone for help.
Yes, hello, I am Red. I'm one half of the YouTube channel Overly Sarcastic Productions. I cover myths and literature, and more recently I focus more on tropes and modern media that I'm brain rotting over. But today I'm dusting off the mythological awareness, pulling out my approximate knowledge of many things to weigh in.
To start with, our understanding of mythology is just a small sliver of the grand discussion of mythology, the grand tradition of what was believed, what was discussed, what was created for thousands of years. We only have a small piece of it. So whatever we do have, it's remarkable we have it, but you need to take into account it's just a small sliver of what is. I think part of our modern understanding of mythology comes from our confusion with modern religious texts. After all, in Christianity, you have the Bible, and the Bible is static. It stays the same, right? Well, no, it really doesn't. Our understanding of the Bible shifts over time. For example, Adam and Eve, right? They're tempted by the devil to eat the fruit of life, right? Well, no. In the Bible, it's just a snake. John Milton, when writing Paradise Lost, turned the snake into Satan, and that's where our modern understanding of the biblical Adam and Eve storyline comes from. Not from the Bible, but from a poem written after the fact. In fact, Satan as a character in mythology shifts over time. In the book of Job, he's presented as on God's side, almost like a defense attorney or a prosecution attorney under the jurisdiction of God. By the time we get to Revelation, Satan becomes an allegorical representation of Rome persecuting the early Christians. And then in Dante's Inferno, a text written outside of the church but about the church, Satan is a prisoner under God's punishment. God runs hell, and Satan is just a prisoner in there. By the time you get to John Milton, you get a modern depiction of what Satan is, the ruler of hell, the ultimate adversary of society. That wasn't really the case for several centuries of Christendom. Hell, if you really want to stir up some controversy, discuss how in the Gospels, Jesus is depicted as more divine in some Gospels and more human in other Gospels. If these inconsistencies exist in a text that's been fairly static, oh wait, no, it hasn't been static, because scribes copy the documents time and time again, they make errors. Translations have changed things, especially the King James Bible, which is often cited in American evangelical discussions. These happened over time, and some books were cut out, such as the famous apocryphal texts, including the Book of Enoch. If that's one religion that we have a very clear through line to today, we have no chance with old mythology. It's completely shifted out of context. It's changed directions in ways we can't even fathom. Obviously, mythology and folklore, they're ever-changing, they're very organic. What are a few reasons why mythology and folklore over time does shift and does change?
So I think that there are several reasons why this happens, and the primary one is that on the grandest scale, cultures are constantly experiencing change just brought on by like circumstance. For instance, like if you have a society that's, for instance, embroiled in a war, a lot of their stories are going to do things like lionizing bravery and like military strength and heroism and fighting those outside your borders. But in times of peace, a lot of those ideas are regarded more skeptically. So a story that initially centered on like this is a great war hero might take that character and kind of move them away into something that's considered heroic at the time. So in the largest scale, the tropes that a society is currently favoring change just depending on like what the current priorities are and like what's considered good versus maybe not so good. On the smallest scale, I think it's because a lot of folk and fairy tales are oral tradition and not the kind that put a lot of effort into preserving information. There's more about this later, but there's quite a lot of folk tales that are essentially just transmitted word of mouth, like, oh, this is a story my mom told me when I was little, but then, you're doing a bedtime story for your kid. Maybe you want to instill a slightly different moral than previous. Maybe it's like, I need this kid to stop, like, jumping down the stairs, so I'll do a little story about how little Jack Horner, sat on the corner and then broke his fucking legs. Let's do something there, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think the fact that a lot of folk tales are, the way I put it is modular. They feel like they're put together by building blocks. It's like, we'll slap in 3 brothers and the oldest 2 are stupid and the youngest one goes off on the adventure. And then we'll throw in a bridge where he meets a weird guardian with riddles he has to do. And then, the kid's still awake. Then he has to go and bake some bread, but the castle is magical and the oven needs to be friends first. That kind of, you just kind of staple elements together. And when I was looking into folk and fairy tales for the purposes of like making more videos about them, I hit this wall because I was like, well, this is just the Lindworm story after the halfway point. Like, okay, you have the motherless child, the childless mother who wants a kid, makes a deal with a witch, given 2 things, told to eat one of them, eats both of them, has one normal kid and one not normal kid, and then the kids go off on adventures, and then at that point it diverges from the Lindworm story, but the first half of it is Lindworm, so do I just be like, watch this video up to this point, and then cut back for the adventures of Tatterhood? It's weird. So I do think that a lot of it is just people put stories together for different purposes, and what we think of as folk and fairy tales are more like a huge corpus of narrative, some literature, some oral tradition, that just kind of all get bundled together. It's like, well, why are all these stories getting told differently? Because they're being told by like a million different people for different reasons.
And would you say, like with heroic myths, for example, that a similar process happens with that as well?
Yes, I think that with hero stories, especially if we're going with like Greek heroes, a lot of it is that the culture, like I mentioned, was changing a lot. For instance, Hercules, the Roman version, is a city founder. Heracles, the Greek version, is more of a monster slayer. So his stories are like, then he went and killed this thing, and then he went and killed this thing, and then he went over here and killed this thing. But then the Romans got a hold of him, and they were like, and then Heracles went over here and had these interesting interactions with these people and founded this city. Yes, the one we're in right now. And then he went over there and did the same thing. And especially in Greek mythology or the actual Greek religion, there were a ton of different like regional beliefs, basically. Every city had like their own twist on a major god. Zeus had like a million different epithets, and a lot of them were like, this is Zeus from this part of the area, and like this is Zeus for this town specifically. And a lot of Greek heroes, I think, made classic, like, for a lot of like folk tales, a lot of the heroes, like, the folkloric Jack, for instance, are actually just like Joe Everyman. They're like a generic figure. Every Jack is not the same. Jack with the beanstalk is not the same as Jack jumping over the candlestick. And in Russian folklore, it's all the noble Prince Ivan, which is pretty funny because it's just Jack again. Whereas with Greek mythology, the heroes are a little more specific, but you do still sometimes get like, we need a hero to legitimize this thing. Let's pull in one of the big ones and say, like, maybe while Jason and the Argonauts were doing this thing, they stopped in here. Or, like, maybe Hercules popped in on his way from point A to point B and legitimized our city as important as well. And a lot of, like, cities had kind of poster boy heroes. So, like, Athens had Theseus, which is, like, the only reason that Theseus gets any billing, because otherwise he did not have a very impressive showing.
Yeah,
so it's like, oh, Theseus did this. Oh, and this thing. And, of course, like Aeneas, minor player in the Iliad, but then becomes hugely important for the large-scale founding of Rome. So all this other stuff gets added to him in retrospect. So it's interesting because I like looking at it through the mythological lens, but so much of this is just intensely political and historical of like, well, why did this happen? Oh, you don't want to know, man. It was basically like, it's kind of the same thing that happens in a lot of Shakespeare plays where you're like, this is really interesting. And then basically a character will turn directly to the audience and be like, and that's why this lineage of kings was good and cool, and anyone descended from them would be a good ruler who really is awesome, and I love their theater patronage. And then they go back to the plot, and it's like, that was weird. What was up with that? There's a lot of that in Greek mythology as well, but it's even more incomprehensible.
Oh no, and plus the history so far back. Like we look at like European, British history, like with Richard III. We know logically why Richard III was written that way. But like, let's say, 2,000 years removed, well, why did they write Hercules this way? Why did they write, Aeneas this way? And it all comes down to that. Why Agamemnon? Well, I can.
Agamemnon. He's hard. He's annoying, and in more ways than one.
Genuinely, yeah. So, what is canon? What are the canonical mythological texts, if there are any? A lot of people nowadays have this modern perspective of religion and mythology, where we look at like a holy book, like a Bible, or the Torah, what have you, and we try to look for that. I think with mythology, with Greek folklore, and I think they kind of take stuff like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, or Antigone and Oedipus is like, to a person who's unfamiliar, they think, oh, these are like the holy texts. They obviously, without any context, think, oh, these were worshipped, not just stories they told about other pre-existing narratives. How do you think our perspective of these texts from a modern standpoint affects the modern perception of these stories that were just stories at the time adapted from other pre-existing folklore?
Yeah, well, I think one of the really interesting things about that is that so many of the texts that we have from ancient Greece were essentially plays that were made, yearly for like the Dionysia theatrical competition. And they were almost all adaptations of stories that the audience was expected to already be familiar with. A huge part of why like Oedipus Rex plays the way it does is because it's built on dramatic irony. It's like, this is a play about the guy who killed his dad and banged his mom, and everyone who goes in like, ooh, juicy, and then they get to see Oedipus gallivanting around for half the play being like, man, as soon as I catch that guy who killed his dad and banged his mom, ooh, I'm gonna show him what for, and they're like, tee hee hee. So, this wasn't codifying the canonical version. It was a version, a retelling of a story that they already knew. But I do think that coming at it from the modern perspective, where some major changes have occurred in what the average person in the modern Western world looking back at this would be doing. There's been a lot of changes, and one of them is like, most people are literate. Most people get most of their storytelling from books or from similarly locked in things like TV shows and movies rather than theater, where a performance can change significantly, even from like week to week, like, oh, we recast this person and now they're doing a different thing. If you're not like a Broadway musical head, you're unlikely to be very intimately aware of that specific thing of like, oh, this actor did it this way, but this one did it that way, and isn't that exciting? So the idea that stories are an innately flexible thing has been severely we've lost sight of it simply because the way that we consume a lot of our stories nowadays is not flexible. You read a book the same way every time. You might notice new things, but the story's not going to change out from under you. But I do think that coming at it from the perspective of a canonical text, a holy book from which deviation of it is not just wrong, but also like morally wrong, I think that kind of infiltrates the way we think about a lot of different religions, and thus we think, well, there must be a right way, there must be a correct path to follow, and therefore it must be locked down, and any deviations from it are wrong. And then you extrapolate that into interpretations of text, and you get, well, this is canon, so anything that isn't in this is wrong. And then you get people arguing over, well, actually, this version is the one that is correct, and every other version from the exact same time period is wrong because it's not the one that I saw first. Comment sections, man.
The other problem is that we tend to have this belief that religion borders on unchanging. After all, Greek mythology was just the myths of Greece, right? Well, what is Greece? Because our modern understanding of Greece as a country is vastly different to what Greece was thousands of years ago. Several separate city-states that were maybe loosely aligned with each other, if even that. All these city-states had their own gods, had their own folklore, had their own beliefs, and they were sometimes contradictory with each other, but over time, through the commingling of cultures, blended. We know Sparta and Athens, but that's like the tail end of Greece's history. What about Minoa? What about Crete? What about all the various little towns and villages with their personal gods and spirits and deities? That coalesces into a form of mythology that we have mostly stuff from the tail end of. We have the compilation stories, but not the folklore that was fractured and fragmented from village to village.
Because we're specifically looking at this from the perspective of like an ancient mythology and therefore an ancient religion, if we are specifically looking at it from that angle of like what were their ancient religious beliefs, there is a serious element of what I call, because I didn't make it up, but what I like the term of being cultural Christianity, where a lot of ideas that are specific to Christianity have sort of perpetuated out into a general assumption of how all religions work. And this was not like an accidental thing. For a while in history, like almost anything anthropological written in like the 1800s is pretty much unusable, because a lot of those anthropologists were starting from the premise that everyone in the world secretly agrees with us. They just don't know it. So we're going to go through and find a way to make their religion make sense with our worldview on what a religion should look like. And the funny thing is, I call this culturally Christian, but what it actually is culturally Roman. And the twist is that a lot of cultural Christianity is from Rome. You know, they learned it from watching them, because that was the way that Rome sort of reinforced a lot of their colonialist and imperialist efforts, was basically being like, oh, you guys must be confused. What you call this, we actually call that. Where it's like, oh, you call him Odin? That's silly. It's Mercury, but I see why you're confused, you know, that kind of thing. Because it's easier to make a connection with a group of people and convince them to acclimate by basically saying, no, we're all worshiping the same guys. You know, your god, my god, yeah, they're the same gods. It's fine. I asked my friend Adam about this because Norse mythology is fully his area of expertise, and I knew that if I didn't, he'd probably be upset. So one thing is, while we roughly probably know who wrote the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson, the Poetic Edda's authorship is uncertain, and it's also, the ones that we have, I think, are copies of older manuscripts, and we definitely don't know who wrote those. Monks did do a lot of saga manuscript writing, but so did people who weren't monks. And the interesting thing that Adam pointed out to me is, two of them. One of them is that almost every surviving like manuscript of Ovid also dates back to the Middle Ages and was probably transcribed by a Christian. We don't just have the original like vellum, I guess, and this doesn't get treated as, oh, automatically there must have been a bias in there. And the other thing that he pointed out that I thought was very interesting, because I would have missed it, is apparently the poetic structures in the Poetic Edda are so complicated that they probably couldn't have rewritten them to be like, and also Jesus was there, without it being incredibly obvious. So that was kind of nice. But the fact that it was being codified by monks did definitely introduce a certain amount of bias into it, as far as anyone can tell. Apparently, the current prevailing theory is that before that phase of things, Norse mythology was more like 1,000 different local religions in a trench coat. The fact that Odin is getting top billing is probably the bias of the Dios Pater, kind of like a big dad god must be the most important figure kind of thing. One of the really interesting things he mentioned is that the description of Ragnarok is very clearly volcanic eruption, but there are only, in the whole Norse world, it's only Iceland that has volcanoes. So that must have dated to after they moved to Iceland and experienced volcanic eruption and were like, that's what the end of the world looks like. So there are all these really interesting little changes. But the fact that Norse mythology was often repackaged in later times as like, these are all Trojans, normal humans, not gods. Like that wasn't the monks transcribing it in the first place. That was weirdos in the 1800s adding like extra. And also Loki's the devil because we see the world in black and white, I guess. But yeah, apparently the fact that it was mostly written down by Christian monks in the first place does not seem to have introduced too much weirdness. But it is unfortunately impossible to know for sure, which is the really frustrating part. Is like these are the only sources we have, and they're not fully reliable. So we sort of have to do legitimate archaeology on them to see how well they can be trusted. And after all this, we still don't know anything about who Loki is, which is it's what he would have wanted. But like, still, it's very funny.
That's in character for him, though. To take
Yeah, absolutely. Someone writes down notes and he's just like, oops, on fire.
In mythology, Loki is well known for defying gender and orientation norms, and Marvel Comics responded by following through with this tradition. Marvel Comics Loki is known to be gender fluid and pansexual. He can transform back and forth into a woman, into a child, into anything, and take on unique identities. But in the films, they avoid this. The only person Loki takes as a lover is himself, or at least a variant of himself, mainly because I think Disney does not want to offend the sensibilities of the more conservative society that the Marvel films are being released into. But as a result, they're ignoring not only the comics, but the long mythological tradition of Loki getting pregnant. Though I suppose the existence of Odin's horse in the Marvel films implies that at some point in the past, Loki did in fact get pregnant as a female horse. Yes, that is where the eight-legged horse comes from. Loki. He made it in his, you get the idea.
I do think that the specific thing you pointed out about, like, yeah, this seems to really piss off a lot of people who have a very conservative attitude towards this is like, yeah, unfortunately, the problem with that conservative attitude is it falls apart if it is at any point proven that back in the good old days, people were still getting weird with it. And yes, they have, the diversity of human experience wasn't invented with the birth of Oscar Wilde. It's always been like that. I do think one very interesting thing is that if you know what to look for and you are not reading a translation that specifically filtered out all of the uncouth stuff, it's kind of everywhere. It's like, oh yeah, Achilles spent some time in his youth disguised as a woman to avoid getting drafted. I think that was his mother's idea so that he wouldn't die tragically, what with his whole cursed destiny kind of thing. But he didn't want it and picked up the weapons and went off and kicked ass anyway. And there's a lot of things like that. I believe there's also a parallel segment in the Mahabharata where one of the characters spends a year as a woman, and that's interesting. Tiresias, the Oracle, gets gender bent by Hera and then gender bent back at some point. Or maybe he was gender bent by Zeus. That one I'm a little bit less clear on. But this does keep happening. Of course, Loki gets real weird with it. But also it's pointed out that Odin does as well. The form of magic that Odin practices is women's magic. And that doesn't really get as much attention because if you're doing the Sky Daddy Diaz Potter kind of thing with him, it's like, well, he's the big man in charge, obviously, and the fact that he's mostly kind of like a sneaky little gremlin going off into weird corners to dig up more forbidden knowledge kind of doesn't fit the narrative and the trope that he was being slotted into, so it gets discarded. The fact that there have been elements of mythology that resonate with modern queer experiences has pretty much always been known for any given meaning of modern queer experience. If you look for it, there will always be characters that are defying gender norms or sexuality or whatever. They're just everywhere. It's usually a casual thing, like Lancelot and Galahad were doing their stuff, 1,000 years ago, and everyone was just kind of minding their damn business about it. And I think that when we take everything and push it through this very more normative filter of like, well, we can't let anything through that isn't man likes woman and woman does only women things and man does only man things, then you filter out a lot of the really interesting weird stuff. Or you only let through the stuff that makes an easy punchline like, and then Loki was pregnant. Isn't that so weird? It's like, yes, but the reason why that one made it through when a lot of the other gender shenanigans didn't is because that one is funny. And a lot of this stuff is okay as long as it's funny. It's a whole thing. There's so much going on here. There's a reason why people get degrees in like gender studies. It's not a punchline. There's really interesting stuff there. It's just not a thing that I ever researched on my own.
Historically, we tend to group a ton of people with common ancestry together, when the reality is vastly different. Just because we connect them in the modern day together does not mean they were connected or even had the same belief system that we might think they do.
And you would get this in a lot of like early 1800s like anthropological efforts. One of the most frustrating experience I had was when I was trying to research Australian Aboriginal, the rainbow serpent, which is one of many creator entities that shows up in a lot of the religious beliefs. But it was the one that got top billing because the guys that were researching it were like, oh, a big sky thing? that sounds like a main god to me, because of course they were doing like the Zeus, Deus Pater, god with a capital G kind of thing, and they were like, big sky thing. Yes, that must be what you think is the most important. And it's like, no, and also it's a different rainbow serpent in like all of these different communities because it's not a monolithic culture. But the idea that everything is secretly the same is a part of anthropology and archaeology that is an error that keeps cropping up, because the world would be a lot easier to understand if everything really did work the same. But the cool thing about history and mythology is that very few things work the same, actually. I do think that it's worth noting that when we see anything from the outside, it's easy to see it as a monolith. And usually the complexities within something only become clear the further in you explore. And a lot of people are content to just kind of skim the surface level, whatever narrative they've heard, and been like, yep, everything there is like that, and I don't need to think about it anymore. And it is truly one of the most frustrating elements of trying to do research in that space, is like, people will be like, this is a Native American folktale, and I'm like, you have not narrowed it down in the slightest. Where did it come from? Who told it to you? Tell me, it's not that hard. And even then, the temptation to draw connections between disparate belief systems, be like, oh, this correlates to that. Sometimes that's a legitimate thing to do. A lot of the Proto-Indo-European reconstructed mythology thing is because people have noticed, like, hey, there's an awful lot of sky fathers in this part of the world. There's a lot of divine twins. There's a lot of, like, spring-like mother goddesses. There's a lot of ocean guy. Like, what's up with that? That's not the only way to make a pantheon, so why does that happen? And so people have traced it back, and they're like, oh, Zeus and Jupiter and Jove, even before they got syncretized together, do seem to have been offshoots of the same core concept. Okay, cool. And then, like, okay, well, you've got, like, in Norse mythology, there's the god war, and then in, like, Celtic mythology, from what we have of it, there's also a god war. Do we think maybe that was correlated? Does the fact that Balor has one eye and Odin has one eye mean anything? That kind of thing. But it's very easy to sort of just fall down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, and B, a lot of just needless minimization of the actually interesting complications of worldwide cultures, and especially in Native American folklore, it can be boiled down very reductively to things like, oh yes, coyote and raven and stuff like that. And it's like, there's so many different coyotes, okay? Coyotes are an animal. People believe a lot of different things about it. Like, here's the Diné story where a coyote creates the starry sky because he gets bored of putting the stars up in constellations and just yeets them all. And he's like, tee-hee, okay, bye. Like, that's good, but that's not the only version of coyote from the entire American continent. And if we act like this coyote is the same as all those other coyotes, we end up reducing him down to a very boring, there's an error to fall into just by assuming simplicity just because we don't understand the complexities of something. But yes.
And there are many factors at play, but some pieces of folklore, it's a little easier to determine when things were added and changed. Take into account Arthurian legend, and by extent, the legends of Robin Hood.
I think that Robin Hood and King Arthur are really interesting figures for that, because they're folk heroes that sort of started getting codified into something resembling a canon. And then, every author that got their hands on them was usually like, I'm not here to just write down the story I heard. I'm here to get weird with it, or do something allegorical, or make a political statement with it, or something like that. Like when I was doing my research on Robin Hood, it's a little bit dusty, so I might not be fully correct about it anymore. But I did think it was interesting that in some of his earliest versions that we have, they were very focused on, like, yes, he's a devout servant of specifically Mary, Mother of Jesus, and he's like he's drinking that respect women juice 24/8, baby, and like that's pretty fun. And then this just doesn't really come up so much recently, where they kind of, especially in modern adaptations, they play more into this sort of like, oh, he's like Batman or Zorro. He's got like a secret identity as a nobleman, and then he goes off and he does crime for a good cause, which resonates more with a modern audience than, oh yeah, he's like big into the Virgin Mary. Don't even worry about it. And with King Arthur, I think the fact that there was so much creative opportunity of just like, make up a knight, take a knight that already exists and do something weird with it. Have a knight, put a knight in a situation, man, just see what happens. Like, it gives a lot of flexibility and freedom to a writer to be like, let's do something a little bit silly with this. Let's bring in some new cool guys. Let's introduce a new cool guy who's, my specialist boy. And then, the next writer is like, yeah, that specialist boy is pretty interesting, but what if, and hear me out on this, he got humbled a little bit. And it's kind of cool because I think the closest parallel my mind is drawing is to the way that like modern superhero comics work, where it's like the characters are pretty locked in, but the writing team changes out from under you constantly, and everyone who deals with them has like a different angle on what they want to do with them. So you end up with these stories where it's like, oh yeah, this author had a point to make, and we're making that point. And then the next one is like, what if he fought like a green guy who was big? That sounds fun. Let's do that. We all need a couple of fighting a green guy chapters to really break up the seriousness. In early stories of like Arthurian knights, there was a lot more like, would that be fucked up or what? Like a weird thing happens, the knights deal with it. That's a little bit goofy. But I think that at some point, when perhaps there was maybe an effort to like, hey, what if the guys that are in charge of our defense and also have all the power and money weren't dicks about it? Then you started getting stories about like knightly codes and chivalry and like saving people. Because one of the things that's interesting if you go back to like Greek hero stories is that like the saving innocence is never a priority. That's not really why they do what they do. It's usually like, oh, I want to kill this thing, or like, oh, a god told me to do this or whatever. And the fact that like it helps people, that's completely tangential. But you do start getting this idea of like, oh, and then this knight rode into town and they were like, please, sir, I am a damsel in distress. Won't you save me from this danger? And he's like, well, of course, fair maiden. And then they just go off and do good things for people who aren't them. And this is, I think, the era that inspired Don Quixote to take the piss out of it, because that whole book is like, everyone's reading all these damn knightly chivalric romances and they're all stupid. And it's just, you know, there's the culture, and then there's the counterculture, and then there's the culture, and then there's the counterculture. So it's like, oh, knights are so cool. Knights are stupid, actually. Well, what if knights were cool again? Well, what if knights are stupid, actually? And, you know, caught in the crossfire of all of this is poor King Arthur, whose own characterization has been getting whipped around wildly because it's like, you know, the real, like, the Welsh origins of this folklore have been almost completely buried under the British stuff, and then the sort of American take on it, which is also weird. But yeah, I don't know. I think that when we have the paper trail, it can help us understand how confusing this can get. Because when we only have like one or two versions, it's like, these are probably the only versions that ever existed, and anything else is just factually wrong. Whereas when we have, you know, all those like Robin Hood broadside ballads, and then also like, you know, we've got like the boys King Arthur, but you're right, we also have like the Morte Arthur, we have Joffrey of Monmouth, where we're like, okay, we can trace some threads, but these are wildly distinct from one another. Does that mean they're all just incorrect when they're trying to replicate the story exactly? And the fact is, most of the people telling those stories weren't trying to replicate the versions they'd heard exactly. They were trying to, you know, draw new threads through or make it a compelling tragedy rather than just, would that be fucked up or what? To the point where it's kind of hard to, like, come to a top-down conclusion of why this happens, because I think it's, you know, it's a different reason for every writer that gets their hands on it.
We can pinpoint a paper trail from decade to decade, from century to century, that change the course of these texts throughout history. You mentioned, like, Robin Hood and King Arthur having their more Americanized versions created, being taken entirely out of the context of Europe and Britain into like the Hollywood film system in terms of like YA novels for like 12 and 13-year-old kids to like consume, which is, again,
everyone wants to grow up and be King Arthur.
Oh yeah, exactly. Some American kid in Ohio is now destined for Excalibur. You know,
the American meritocracy meets the sword and the stone, and it's like, I could draw that someday.
It's like, what was it, the one guy versus 100 bears? It's like, I can take the bears. Like, yeah, I can pull out Excalibur from the stone.
You can draw the sword from the stone, yeah.
That's easy enough. How do you think... sorry,
I had like a tiny little tangent about that. One of my favorite parts, like the most... If you focus on this, you see the changing shape of Arthuriana, and it's just the concept of Excalibur. Because it's like, oh, Arthur's got a cool sword called Caliburn. It's classical folklore. Everyone's got a cool sword. And then it's like, oh, Excalibur, the magic sword that marks him as king. But also, something else has to mark him as king, because we're not doing that thing where he's just king now. We're doing the thing where he's like raised by peasantry. So how does he prove it? Oh, he draws the sword out of an anvil. Okay. Is that Excalibur? No, it's a different sword. He gets Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. Oh, who's that? Don't worry about it. And it's just, but then, like, that gets combined into, like, well, why would he have two swords? Let's do one sword, and let's make it a more dramatic thing. Let's make it so everybody knows. So Excalibur's the sword stuck in the stone, sure. And it's just, it's interesting. I feel like I've said that specific sentence so many times, but, you know, the idea that this part of the story gets streamlined down for ease of understanding, like, we don't want to keep track of all these different swords. So the next teller is like, I'll just make Excalibur also the sword in the stone for clarity and pacing, so that I'm not here all night. And when you look at it from that perspective, of course all these things keep changing. You know, every writer is making those decisions, those tweaks for pacing or characterization or something like that, you know, to make it flow a little bit more smoothly or fit the needs of the storyteller in the moment. And from that perspective, it's kind of amazing that there's any concept of canon at all. But yes, I cut you off mid-question. I'm sorry.
No. Actually, following your train of thought, because it kind of tied in with what I was going to say anyway. I think of, I'm not sure if you've seen the film Excalibur, the John Boorman film.
I haven't actually.
It's, well, you may not want to when I say this.
Good.
He tried to make like the perfect adaptation of King Arthur, and he tried to include everything he could fit in like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, give or take. In the 80s. So, you know, he was going to do Lord of the Rings initially in one film, but then he lost the rights, so he did Excalibur instead.
A much more reasonable quantity of story to fit into 2 hours than Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's if you've ever imagined a movie where events happen but characters don't feel like they fit into those events all too well, that's Excalibur. Like they speed run everything.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
And like it kind of proves the point that maybe modern adaptations should take some liberties with these texts. Like maybe it's I don't want to go into like an autistic excitement over different movies I do, but like I talk about, but like it kind of proves the point that maybe just because you could make a super faithful adaptation, whatever that means, doesn't mean you should. In that sense, I think
that when it comes to quality of adaptation, and this is of course also a tangent, but there's the question of both, you know, what story are you adapting and what purpose are you adapting it for and what medium are you adapting it to? Because things that fly by in prose or can be easily skipped over, like the Iliad Boatless chapter, don't necessarily flow if you're hearing them said aloud or running through the entire list on a TV screen or something like that. It's a different kind of story. And that means that the parts of it that pop in one medium might not really work so well in another. Sorry, we're fully in the tangent zone now, but this one's going to be very short. They made, at least partially, an Animorphs comic adaptation. And in terms of stories that work far better when they're just prose and you don't need to see what's happening, Animorphs is like top of the charts because every time they're like, all right, guys, it's time to morph, you have to deal with like 2 pages of the most horrific things ever put to page. And then it's like, all right, now I'm a fish, time to do the thing. And it's like, man, I knew this was happening when I read the book, but I didn't have to see it. And this really changes the experience of reading it in a way that like, I'm not sure they did on purpose, but honestly, they probably did.
My memory of Animorphs, though, having terrifying body horror transformations may actually fit better. I'm not even sure.
Yeah, maybe it makes it harder to ignore the whole horrors of war child soldiers thing that Kay Applegate was going through with it. But like, you know, when you're adapting a story, sometimes being true to the original, when the original could be like 15 books and your adaptation has to be 2 hours of movie, means that you have to change a few things. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. Like, I think the way the Lord of the Rings movies we got ended up adapting the books is mostly good. I have very few complaints about it, and most of them are just that they kind of did my boy Gimli dirty. But I also got a chance to see the Lord of the Rings stage musical, where they compress it even more. And I think they compressed it too much. They did this thing where they were like, if something could conceivably be framed as having happened twice, it only happened once. And that means instead of there being 2 different human kingdoms we deal with, you know, Gondor and Rohan, there's one. And Boromir's dad is basically just Theoden. They don't name him, but he has all of Theoden's lines. He's under Saruman's control. He dies heroically in the final battle. There's no sign of Faramir. There's no sign of Éowyn or Éomer or any of those guys. We don't get Éowyn versus the Witch King. We have to cut all that for time. And it's like, that's too much. You cut out a lot of the good stuff by doing that, but it was very efficient, and I give you credit for that. So
I don't even know how to respond to that.
When Boromir was like, when Boromir was like, you have to go see my father. He's under a sort of spell. I was like, they couldn't possibly be doing what I think they're doing, could they? But yes, adaptation is a fascinating little rat's nest of confusion, and I think the specific thing of like, well, they left out this thing, but would it have been better if they included it, or would it have just made everything more confused? It's a hard question. You know, there's no one right answer every time.
If you apply the trend you see with Arthur and Robin Hood to mythology, then Odysseus might have followed a similar trajectory, with different elements of the story being added over time. Same with Hercules. Hercules in Marvel is defined as being one of the heroes. He is known to fight Thor on occasion, sure, but he is generally good-natured. He is also known for having a wide range of lovers, who he often treats tenderly. Meanwhile, DC's Hercules is well known for his conquests. That's one word for it, I guess. Specifically, how he forced himself on Hippolyta, the mother of Wonder Woman, and enslaved all of the Amazons to his will. In one story, Hercules is a dashing hero with a list of lovers in triple digits. While in DC, he's a monster. He's the reason why Paradise Island hates men, and incredibly, partially why Wonder Woman has trouble getting into the world of man when Steve Trevor lands on Paradise Island's shores. Between Marvel and DC, even right there, Marvel Hercules, he's basically like a slightly more anti-heroic version of Thor, like slightly more, not even like that far gone in terms of...
Not even that bad. He's only slightly worse. Just so that they can bring him in to fight Thor on occasion, and then they'll be like, "Oh, brothers in arms, we're bros now." You don't need to do much. And of course, like Disney Hercules is just like he's Superman. He's a blonde Superman who can't fly. That's all. And that's fine. It's not really accurate. I think a lot of people who watched that movie and were like, "Wow, Hercules is so cool," and then they read any of the myths and were like, "What do you mean he kills Megara?" Like, yeah, she's the one that gets murdered when Hera drives him mad because she's mad about him. Like, again, the movie is fine. It's not accurate. It's not trying to be accurate, and that's okay. Stories can be what they are without trying to be accurate renditions of other stories. But I do think that a lot of people who are married to the idea of a canon version, a one correct take on a character, I think for them it can be very upsetting to see two different versions of the same character. Because it's like, well, one of them has to be wrong, and anyone who's doing that has to be wrong to do it. And it's all extrapolating off this flawed premise that there can be only one correct version of a given story and character.
Ultimately, a lot of what we're seeing in Marvel and DC is kind of what Homer and Sophocles did with their stories, taking accounts, taking tradition that already existed, and reapplying it to tell a compelling, dramatic narrative.
I like mythological Thor a lot. I also really like Marvel Thor. They're not really the same guy, and that's okay. I think that when Marvel really plays with like the Norse gods as a concept, I think that they tap into some of my favorite parts of superhero storytelling in the process, which is just how wide and weird the world can be. And one of my favorite things about superheroes is how there's no attempt at power balance. You have in the same team Hawkeye and Thor, and one of them is a god who's thousands of years old and shoots lightning out of his eyes, and the other one is a guy who's pretty good with a bow. And they're just hanging out. They're in the same group chat. That's amazing. I love that. Superheroes that really just get to lean on that are really fun. But I think that Thor, as an adaptation of the god Thor, is... They take a lot of liberties, and they make him a different kind of character, because in the mythology, Thor really only has a couple defining traits, which are that he is incredibly strong, and that he's kind of a blunt instrument. He's not really good at anything that doesn't involve hitting stuff, and there are many stories that put him in situations that cannot just be punched out of. So when Mjolnir is stolen, that's the most iconic story, Mjolnir is stolen by Thrym, King of the Frost Giants, he has to go get it back, and by that, Loki has to go and get it back with Thor along for the ride, and Thor has to disguise himself as Freya in the process. So that's, okay, yeah, Thor is just kind of there until he can get his weapon back, and then it's just giant killing time. Great, amazing. And then there's like one story where he's trying to get from one point of a river to another, one side to the other, and the boatman is on the other shore just yelling insults at him the entire time, and nobody knows what this story means, and like, is the boatman Odin or Loki fucking with him? Who knows? Maybe it's just some guy, and like, Thor doesn't even get to ride the boat, he has to walk around, and it's like, how does that work? Why is he doing this? Can't he just jump or fly? And they're like, nope. There's a river in the way, didn't you see? So that Thor, very little resemblance to Marvel Thor. Marvel Thor still has the same, he's very strong, bit of a blunt instrument, good at solving specific problems, but things that are sort of outside his wheelhouse don't really work very well for him. So in the broadest strokes, the character could be seen as very similar. But the thing is, when you take the character of a god, and you take him out of the context of a myth where everyone he's dealing with is a god, and put him in the context of ostensibly something that resembles reality, he becomes a very different kind of character. Because if goofy Thor, who doesn't really know what he's doing, deals with normal New York, the buildings are going to get tipped over. It's not going to go good. So instead, for Marvel, they make this version of Thor where he is very strong, but he's also kind of just good-natured. He's got that chivalric thing we were talking about with the Arthurian knights. Like, we give this character who has a lot of power just, a general decency, code of honor, a want to protect people who aren't as strong as him. We give him a heroic motivation that he doesn't need in the original myths because he's there to kill giants. That's what he's for. So you end up with a version of the character who, in a lot of the comics, they will draw on like weird myths or whatever. They'll be like, oh, remember that time that happened? Oh, this is Odin. He's got his spear Gungnir. We're doing all this stuff. Great, amazing. Or that one time that happened with the time the hammer got stolen. Oh, well, let's not talk about that. Tee hee hee. And then, back to dealing with Marvel Comics problems. And I think that's a really clean way to handle a character who could have theoretically at some point fit the characterization of original Thor, but it's had a couple thousand years of character development to get out from that. And for instance, the movie, Kenneth Branagh's Thor movie, which I will defend till my dying day, is
same.
like, yeah, it starts off with that. Like, when we first meet Thor, that's basically accurate. He's kind of an asshole. He parties hard. He kills giants. He doesn't really listen to anybody. He takes offense very easily. He's really only good at hitting stuff hard. And then Odin is like, you need to go in timeout. And then he yeets him to Earth. And then Thor kind of has to, he gets a little humbled. He figures some stuff out. And this is drawing on an element in the comics, which I've only briefly looked over, but it was kind of a retcon because originally Donald Blake was just a guy, and then he basically found Mjolnir and became Thor and was like, wow, I've assumed the form of the mighty Norse god Thor. And then he goes back to being normal Dr. Donald Blake. And then later it was like, Donald Blake was never real. He's always been Thor. But Odin made him that to teach Thor humility so he would be less of an asshole. And so the comics and the movies both are like, yeah, original Thor wouldn't have made great hero material. He's strong, but he doesn't have the attitude. So we fixed that, and now he's fine. He's a certified good boy, which is, it's fun. And I think that it's certainly a way to do it. He's not myth accurate, but he's not trying to be. They're like, we started from there, and now he's a new kind of character. We gave him a moral code.
In this sense, it became clear immediately that Thor underwent a change much like King Arthur did over the course of the various stories. He went from a warlord to a noble hero, defined by chivalry. With DC, Hercules especially, they present him as an assaulter.
Yeah.
And he's very clearly presented as negative, though some might argue that's accurate to some versions of Hercules from mythology. And through our modern perspective, I hate saying modern perspective, we just discovered last week that this is a bad thing to do to people, but historically, it wasn't always framed that way in media,
Which is interesting because through a lot of Greek mythology, a character assaulting a woman is regarded as a horrific act. It's like, this is what got Athena really mad at this guy. But again, a lot of these main characters of these stories aren't being framed as good people doing only good things. A lot of the time it's like, yeah, and then they did this fucked up thing. The sack of Troy after the Trojan War is... it's war crimes bonanza. Everyone's doing really bad stuff. It's why the ships get scattered by a storm, because Athena's like, that's too many war crimes. Get out. So, even in ancient Greece, it's like, oh, that's a bad thing to do. This guy did a bad thing. It's just they're not always narratively punished for it. It's like, yeah, they did this fucked up thing. When Zeus abducts a woman and carries her over the sea, they're usually like, listen, I know that was really bad, and I'm really sorry, but you get to be a queen of this new land. You're the origin story for this community of people who have this story. It's not like the girl's like, well, guess I'm over here now, the writers know that it's a fucked up thing. It's just, but from a modern perspective, it's like, it's not just a fucked up thing. It's like, doing that makes you the unequivocal villain of the piece, and we really want something bad to happen to you in retaliation, that kind of thing.
Marvel and DC were not the first to play fast and loose with mythology. Sailor Moon draws from the Greek myth of the moon goddess Selene and her slumbering lover Endymion, and turns it into a fairy tale. Fate's Day Night takes Arthurian legend along with several other myths and just gender bends King Arthur. And Magi, the legend of magic, is heavily inspired by the 1001 Arabian Nights. But with Marvel and DC, the situation is a little more complicated. Because of course it is.
It's not bad to interpret something. I'd say that, it is possible to interpret something and then do it wrong by saying my interpretation is the correct one. And, at that point it's misinformation because that's simply not true. But I think somebody telling a story, especially in a modern superhero reimagining context, like, I certainly hope nobody's going to Marvel for their Norse mythology education. The Eddas are right there, guys. Oh no, oh no.
You know someone has though. You know someone. Like
I understand, like, absorbing it passively through pop culture, but like, whatever.
Another huge issue with Marvel and DC as adaptations is that we change the characteristics of various characters in ways that's kind of surprising. You might think you know Odin or Thor. They are like these great heroes, but that's not really the case.
But I did notice when we were initially discussing the questions for this video, you brought up as a point of comparison the way that Thor is portrayed in the God of War Ragnarok and the previous game. Yeah, and also I'll bring this one in because I also watched the Zack Snyder Norse mythology show, Twilight of the Gods, which I initially wasn't planning on watching because when someone was like, "Are you going to watch the Zack Snyder Norse mythology show?" I said, "There's not a single encouraging word in that sentence." But then I watched it and I was like, "Oh, you know what? This is actually pretty solid. Like it's not groundbreaking material, but Snyder kind of works best when he's stitching together something out of other better stories, and this is very much that." But it also has a very similar take to Thor's God of War Ragnarok, so I wanted to bring it up as like 2 points of contrast, where it's like, okay, if Thor is a clean-shaven blonde, he's going to be a certified good boy, and if he's a hairy redhead, he's probably going to be kind of a jerk. And theoretically a little closer to his original mythological characterization. And in God of War, he's of course introduced as an antagonist, or like he's sort of threatened as an antagonist until he actually shows up in Ragnarok and becomes a major player. Which is a good job of building the tension. Like, you're not even dealing with any of the big name Norse gods in that first game. You're just dealing with like his dipshit sons, and it's like, uh-oh, how bad's Thor gonna be? But if you take the initial structure of Norse mythology at face value, Thor is not like a good person, but he's on the side of the good guys. It's like, yeah, giants are evil, they do bad things, they're jerks, whatever. But also, again, it's like the Greek heroes. They're not overly concerned with convincing you that the heroes are doing good things. The heroes are just doing things. But then if you ask the question, are giants really evil, or is Thor just doing some genocides? Well, that's a very easy question to answer differently. And of course, God of War Ragnarok was like, yeah, Kratos' kid is Loki, and his dead wife is Laufey. So the giants aren't bad in this. We like the giants. We wish they weren't dead. And that means Thor is the instrument of their destruction, and we're going to unpack that. And Twilight of the Gods did something extremely similar. I wonder why. It's fine. Whatever. We all have different talents, and Snyder's very good at directing, and the writing part doesn't need to be his job.
He would make a great cinematographer, I feel like. He'd be amazing at that. But like everything so else. Yeah, exactly.
I think we just need to let Snyder make like music videos. I think that would really be his passion. I think he'd be very good at that. Short, concise, all the pretty visuals, nothing complicated stitching them together. But the idea that like Thor can be characterized in a way that is true to his mythological version, but also profoundly antagonistic. It's not that difficult. His primary thing is that he hits hard. You just need to point him at people who we don't want him to kill. That's like the one thing mythological Thor is good at. And I do think for a lot of people who grew up with like fun chivalric Thor, it's kind of jarring to see this guy who's, wearing the face and vibes of this character you like, but he's, a murdering bastard. It's like, hey, wait, what are you doing to my boy? And it's like, it's okay. We've branched it. They're different boys now. They're different angles on the same boy. And you don't need to like mythological Thor for the same reasons you like Marvel Thor.
In the sense, of course, it's interesting how Loki's motivation in that first Kenneth Branagh Thor film is to destroy all the frost giants. He is doing what Thor did in mythology, taking a very broad, ultimately destructive measure to annihilate a race of entities he sees as a threat, as harmful. Yes, he uses subterfuge to get to that goal, but he ultimately does blast a giant laser into their world to blow it up. This is something Thor from mythology probably would have done if he could have done it. Annihilate them all in one swift go. And yet Thor, due to his characterization in the movies, realizes this is a genocidal plan and tries to stop Loki. It's interesting, therefore, that Loki takes the position Thor in mythology took. Odin in the MCU, in the comics, he is the All-Father. He's more like a Zeus role than he
Mm-hmm.
was in the original Norse. He's like I said before, some gremlin who goes digging in tunnels to find like, oh, I'll pluck my eye out for a little bit more magic,
Yeah.
And he feels like he's way wiser than the more investigative Odin in some myths, I feel like,
Mm.
which I think is
Yeah.
interesting. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that? Like with certain gods who kind of become almost like deified, almost too much beyond what they were originally seen as.
Yeah, well, I do think that this one has a pretty simple answer, and it boils back down to the pop culture Christianity thing we were talking about. Because if your primary worldview on what a god looks like is big sky father, important halo, glowing eyes, whatever, because like capital G God from Christianity doesn't really officially have a physical form, but most people imagine him looking like Zeus for no reason, I'm sure. So Odin gets kind of Zeusified to make him a larger, more powerful, like gooder god. I think the TV trope for this is Big Good, where it's like you have a incredibly powerful force for goodness that in a pinch the heroes can call on for help. So like when Thor's in over his head, and then it's like, good news, Odin's here, the problem has been fixed. Like I think Earth's Mightiest Heroes season 1 basically did that. And it's like, great, okay, cool. No worries anymore. The boss man has arrived.
Add to that the idea of evil, the trickster gods, especially Loki.
If you go back with the concept, like the Jewish concept of God, and more specifically the Jewish concept of Satan, just a guy doing a job, the voice of opposition, essentially. The prosecuting attorney. If you read like Book of Job, pretty classic example. Devil being like, well, does he really like you? Or is he just, comfortable and therefore his life is easy and so he's not doing anything bad? And God's like, that's a good point. Let's find out. Christian God and Christian concept of Satan is very different. It's almost, at the risk of, I guess, blaspheming, it's almost a little more dualist. It's almost like Zoroastrian kind of, where it's like there's a god of good and an almost equally powerful god of evil. And this isn't the official belief system, but it does seem to be how a lot of the pop culture concept of Satan comes up, is like, oh, not only does this figure have real, true, terrifying power, but he's also a corruptive force, and just by being near him, he can make you worse. Whereas, the theoretical source of this concept, the Jewish concept of Satan, is just like, no, he's just there to suggest the bad thing. It's still up to you what you actually do. And so when you have this pop culture idea of like there's a god of good and there is an almost godlike being of evil and they are fighting each other, then you end up with two very powerful tropes that things will start falling into if they look too much like them. So that's how you get Loki being far more malevolent than he usually is in Norse mythology when he's readapted for modern stories. They're like, oh, they make Loki the deceiver. They make him there to make everyone around him worse. And you can get some really cool characterization out of that. But original Loki being just kind of a weird little gremlin who they get in to solve problems that usually are his fault anyway. And then Odin is kind of the same thing in a different font, to the point where there's a theory that maybe Odin and Loki are different facets of the same deity, or they were originally. I don't know. I mean, you can find a Norse myth theory for basically anything, but that one I thought was interesting, because there are a lot of similarities.
What they were in the mythology is vastly different than what they are in modern adaptations. As an extension of what happened with Loki, let's take a look at Wonder Woman and Ares. Ares is of course motivated by several different things throughout the various versions of DC, whether that's expanding his dominion of war, proving mankind is warlike in nature, or just, obliterating everything, as is the case in the Wonder Woman movie from Patty Jenkins. It takes the core idea that Ares represents and extrapolates it. Is mankind inherently warlike? Is it inevitable that we will destroy ourselves? Meanwhile, the mythological Ares just seems to represent the cosmic forces of war, in particular, destructive, all-out, maddening war. He exists as a counterbalance to Athena. Whereas Ares is again more destructive, Athena is more strategic. It's indeed no wonder that Athena's representative in the Trojan War is Odysseus, who sacks Troy not thanks to overwhelming force, but rather through wits and cleverness with the construction of the Trojan horse. But in this sense, Ares' role in the Wonder Woman movie is kind of counter to this. He exists less as a force of all-out destruction and violence, but rather a secret schemer behind the scenes, a Mephistopheles sort of figure. In this sense, it seems kind of counter to the mythological figure of Ares, doesn't it?
Yes, his plans still rue destruction, and he destroys the Greek pantheon, but at the same time, he works through clever suggestion and subversion. But then again, what better counter is there to Ares than Diana of Themyscira, a diplomat between Paradise Island and mankind's world, a figure who subverts the destructive tendencies of the patriarchy with diplomacy and firm, precise action.
I do also think one interesting thing about the way the DC handles the Greek gods, although I'm less familiar with this, is, as I understand it, they're mostly there in the context around Wonder Woman. Because of course she, Themyscira, the Amazons, kind of have a tumultuous relationship with the male gods, especially in different versions. Absolute Wonder Woman is doing a thing where they sort of play up that, like, yeah, the gods are kind of bastards, like they're terrified of Diana and what she represents, and they're being dicks about it, that kind. And by the gods, I mean the boy gods, not the
basically.
goddesses for the most part. So there's a lot of very nuanced historical and mythological gender politics wrapped up around Wonder Woman as a concept, and that means that a lot of the Greek gods are sort of posited in opposition to her in various different ways. Of course, Ares is a primary antagonist for a lot of her different stories, and he varies from big man who hits things to the very interesting version they did in the movie. Weedy little Remus Lupin with a stupid mustache, that kind of thing. Honestly, big props, though, because I wasn't expecting that to be the face of war, but it made perfect sense in hindsight, which is the best kind of twist.
And forget Hades. Hades is screwed by that.
Hades is the Greek god that usually gets hit with the Satan ray, because he's like a death god and spooky, and he runs the underworld, and that must make him the other guy we know of who is bad and in the underworld, the big man Lucifer himself, and that is not correct at all, but it's a very easy connection to draw when you have this worldview where it's like if you're a god, you're either a big good one or a big bad one, and maybe for flavor, we can throw in, you can be like a mother goddess or something like that. There are other god tropes that have gotten popular over the years. But the big one of big sky daddy and a nasty, mean, bad one who makes other people worse, those are like the two big ones. And if you are anywhere close to those gravitational wells, you risk your characterization getting drawn into one of those two, event horizons and just becoming Zeus in a different font or cartoon Lucifer in a different font.
Yeah, I think the only one that really is spared of that maybe is Osiris, I think, in terms of death gods, who doesn't drag. But that's because you already have another evil deity in the mythology already that gets that position.
They just go on set and make him basically Satan, even though far more cartoonish in terms of bad guys. And Set is interesting. He's not even unilaterally bad. He helps protect Ra through the journey to the underworld. Again, the idea that you can make things simple without in some way also making them inaccurate is a very frustrating part of a lot of these adaptations, because, again, I don't think that doing a version of a character where they are one of these tropes is bad. I do think that asserting that the version of the character who fits the tropes is the only correct one is bad, and that is one of the things that frustrates me about a lot of this analysis, is people will retroactively go back and be like, yes, this is how this works, and it's like, I assure you it is not. Again, I'm speaking from the specific, the Jewish concept of Satan. That's a personal pet peeve of mine, because, whenever anyone in any, Christian context is like, well, we derived our concept of Satan from you. It's like, you didn't learn that shit from us, okay? We don't have that. We don't even have hell. What are you talking about?
Our understanding of tradition with mythology is itself flawed. But the new stories have an opportunity to examine the parts of folklore that are just not explored all that much in the surviving texts that we have. There are countless characters who appear briefly in myths, who can be examined, expanded upon, whose characters and actions can be reinterpreted through a modern lens. A lot of modern adaptations will take lesser known characters, or even heroes of some note, and try to humanize them more. There's been a lot of cases of, especially with the novel Song of Achilles or Circe or stuff like that, where it's like you take these characters who may be kind of, I don't want to say one note because that sounds reductive, but very broad strokes kind of actions, broad strokes kind of personality. And you try to go, okay, what's the psychology here? What's the emotional journey that they went on? And I feel like that's a very interesting reinterpretation. It's gotten some criticism from some people, I want to emphasize, maybe softening the characters up too much, or making them too, maybe deviating too far from the quote-unquote real versions of the myth, as we discussed previously. It's a whole misnomer.
Yeah, the canon, yeah.
What do you think of that kind of tradition of humanizing these characters more through our modern lens? Do you think that's a natural progression? Do you think it's a part of the storytelling process? Or do you feel like maybe some writers maybe go too far with it and deviate too far from what the characters should be on some form, if that's even possible?
Well, I do think it's interesting. Geez, I feel like somebody should keep account of how many times I've said that.
I'll keep a track on the bottom of the screen when I put in the video.
Let's just assume it's all interesting, and I'll skip over that part. The thing that I've noticed about a lot of older stories, and this is part of the reason I made the channel in the first place, is because I was having a lot of trouble clicking into them. I found them rather boring and hard to, relate to, and it started off with Shakespeare, because, of course, pretty much everyone's class does them a disservice by making them read it like a book. It's a play. Watch it like a play and you will understand that they are actually really cool. But if you're just sit there in class reading it, only the dialogue, it's not going to be fun. They're not designed for that. But, the Iliad and the Odyssey also kind of dry a lot of the time, a little bit disconnected. You'll usually just kind of get clinically told that something is happening, even if that something is somebody's horrible death. Or you'll be told, like, oh yeah, this character's real sad. He's real bummed out about this. He was really sad about it for 6 days and nights. And then he put on his armor and he killed 17 dudes. And then, they move on. And it's like, okay, yeah, that sounds like it was probably really hard for him. But, I don't care because you haven't made me. And some of this, I think, is because of changing trends in storytelling. And also some of it, I think, is that if we take an oral tradition and we write it down, we maybe lose some of the delivery that you might have had if you were hearing it told to you out loud. But I do think that taking a story as it's written and then basically just kind of punching it up, letting the sad moments breathe, exploring how a character feels in that moment, rather than just being like, he was sad and he wrapped himself in blankets in his tent and he didn't do anything. You can really get in on why he's sad, what's going through his head, how he's feeling about that. Of course, Achilles specifically, I'm talking about, as if there were another sad boy in blankets in his tent. Be weird if it had happened twice. But yeah, no, I'm a big fan of the specific kind of storytelling of this is what happened, but let's get in the weeds of how everybody was feeling when it happened. And there's a lot of room for that, especially in more, older stories that are told in a slightly more dry tone by our modern standards. Because, you can get a lot of angst out of those things. It's there, present. The characters are feeling it, but the audience isn't necessarily feeling it. So just taking that and being like, here's everything that's happened, but maybe let's add a couple conversations that weren't shown but could have happened, or, let's just really dive deep into this character's inner monologue as they're experiencing the fear and pain and upset of this thing that's going on around them. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I generally think there's very little wrong with most forms of writing. I'm very much in the, live and let live school of messing around with this sort of thing. I do, of course, think that, again, the only danger is if you do that and you're like, this is the correct version, this was really what was going on, this is the story you never told, but it's the true version, yada, 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 Just being incorrect really bothers me more than anything else. But the specific kind of, let's just put a magnifying glass over this character's inner world and just explore what was going on with them while all this stuff was happening, I think that's a lot of fun, and there's a ton of potential for that. And again, like I said with Shakespeare, just seeing that performed well can get that across, where, a good actor can make you understand, what by whom means when it's performed by an actor who knows their shit, rather than when you're reading it, you're like, 3 words? We got 3 words in response to the death? What are you talking about? I don't know why they insist on doing that. You could just take them to the local theater and see it that way.
So many freaking movie adaptations, too. Just put one of
There's
those
so
on.
many movies. You can watch the miniseries of Macbeth with Patrick Stewart as Macbeth.
Yeah,
and that lady whose name I can't remember with the killer cheekbones is Lady Macbeth. It's great. Just watch that.
I've seen it. I'm trying to who it is. I'm trying. Of course, now I can't remember it either.
Yeah.
Not to go off on too much of a tangent, but mythology is this long tradition with characters of old that are remarkable and incredible, but there's been limited ways we've interpreted them.
One such character given an expansive role in the comics is Circe. Now, Circe is a witch in the comics, blessed by Hecate, with incredible power, who loses her soul to hell. Yes, the Christian hell, not the Greek Hades, and was in a desperate search for it. This is one of the many interpretations of Circe in DC, of course. There's multiple continuities, but I think it's very interesting that Circe is tied up with Hecate, when in the Odyssey, Circe is an enchantress who hates men and turns them into pigs, and is the daughter of Helios. Though some traditions do also make her the daughter of Hecate, but I digress. What's interesting is that Circe in myth is a figure who prays and punishes men, mainly for their lust and sloth and wrath, turning them into pigs, essentially. There's some joke and humor there, I'm sure. But in the comics, she's primarily an adversary to Wonder Woman, who is, very obviously, not only not man, but diametrically opposed to the world of man. So, I think it's very interesting DC took this character and completely put them in a new context, yet at the same time, kept the core, recognizable characteristics of Circe from the Odyssey. She is an obstacle who uses magic, an enchanting force who is difficult to actually confront directly.
The modern depictions of these gods can really date back to the last few centuries with the Renaissance. Statues of these gods, paintings of these goddesses, but our understanding is very different. Compare the Venus of Greek mythology to another specific Venus statue. The depiction of beauty and fertility is vastly different from culture to culture, because what we prioritize as beautiful and what we see as an ideal, another culture might not. And our understanding of these cultures is so limited because we are looking at it through a modern lens.
The specific concept that, like, the pop culture boots on the ground understanding of the religious beliefs, they don't often line up with the canon in the designated book. And thus the tropes around what a divinity looks like have, you know, they don't line up with what we see in the actual canon of the Tanakh or, you know, the Bible. It's just, we have a vision of what God looks like, and even though, you know, it's always described as like, oh, unknowable, wheels within wheels, rainbows, books and stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, the big guy with the fluffy cloud hair and beard and the toga. What do you mean? It seems pretty knowable to me. And again, you know, this is why tropes are tools, but they can't be trusted, because they will give you the boiled down, easy version of something. The most easily digestible version of a story is usually the one that becomes a trope that's easily replicated, and that's usually not the most correct or the most helpful version, but it is the one that is the most mimetic, so it sticks around. Which is why pop culture Lucifer is such a useful cartoon character to have around, because it's like, what if there was a big bad guy, you know? What if there was like a source of evil, and he was strong, but like we could still kick his ass, but it was hard, rather than what if the guy on our side was omnipotent and all-powerful and all-knowing and there was no opposition force, you know?
Yeah.
One of them makes a more exciting story, even if it is, you know, sacrilegious.
One question I think I can ask is regarding future productions, be it comics, be it film, be it musicals, be it books. What are some elements of mythology and folklore, and this is a very general one, so you can take it in any direction you want, that you kind of wish that they would do, that they haven't really done in the recent past, or even done frequently in the recent past? So it could be something that's done a little bit, but not too often, but something that you feel is underutilized from folklore mythology that you think would be really interesting, maybe in a big budget adaptation, or a TV show not made by Zack Snyder, or what have you.
Yeah, that is a very, very broad question. It's I feel like I'm snagging on one of my oldest pet peeves, which I'm not even sure if it technically answers the question. I always feel like when you get like a modern adaptation of a classic myth, they don't get weird enough with it visually. And it's especially there. I've got like a short list of Shakespeare plays where I'm like, make these as animated movies now, you cowards, and they never do. I think that A Midsummer Night's Dream could be the most visually fascinating experience ever. And they just never really do it. They're like, the fairies look like people. The people also look like people. Don't even worry about it. Everyone's wearing bikes in the forest now. Who even cares? And I'm just like, okay, this could have been so much cooler. You know, The Tempest is another one with like fantastical elements that are almost always downplayed. And I think when you're doing an adaptation of a myth, especially in the modern context, because this is not a tangent. It's just kind of a little aside. I think that when we take old myths through a modern lens, we draw sort of a hard line in the world building, where it's like, gods, they're a kind of being that are beyond mortal, and then there's mortals, and they're over here, they're like us, you know, they're people, we get them, we understand how they work, and then there's like spirits, and like fae, you know, like dryads and naiads and satyrs, and trolls and Jotuns and stuff like that. They're over here in the sort of weird, they're not gods, they're not people, they're something else kind of category, whatever. And then in practice, the idea that there's something about gods that is completely beyond mortal either gets downplayed or sort of played in a very simple way, where it's like, yeah, they live up on big fluffy cloud heaven and that's why they're special, or they all glow or whatever. But and if you kind of try and go back to the original context these stories were being told in, it's not so much gods are this powerful being. It's more like a god is like a concept turned into a person's shape. Like Zeus is, he's got this attitude, he's capricious, he does this, he does that. It's like Zeus isn't a person, you guys. He's a set of rules. He's how you're supposed to operate in this society. He's credited with things, and then he's blamed for other things. He's the principle that if somebody's your guest, you have a responsibility to protect them. He is the storm. He's all these other things. He's not... and then he's also this guy with a big beard and a toga and a lightning bolt in his fist. We see the physical image representation of these gods, and we're like, that's them. And all this other stuff is like superpowers that this guy has. And I think that this is probably something that it would be interesting if I could see them capture it, but I'm not sure how you would do it, which is the actual divinity behind a god made manifest. Because you usually either wind up with like a person, but glowy, or like a person, and we didn't even bother to make him glow. I think the boringness of designs of gods incarnate is something that bothers me a lot in myths being retold. I will give Hades Town a pass because everyone's outfits are very scrumptious, and I'm okay with that. And also, they're human beings on a stage, and there's only so much you can do. But like, if you have full creative freedom, you could get so weird with it, and they so rarely do. But I do think that moving away from the idea of gods are like people but stronger, and exploring more of like, what does it actually mean to embody something as vast as like the concept of hunting, or the concept of poetry and music, or the concept of war, something like that. What does it actually mean to be around a god made manifest? What is it like to look at them and know that you're only seeing a fraction of what they really are? That's hard to communicate. It might not even be possible to communicate visually. It might be one of those prose only things. In the same way that there's a lot of elements of horror that really only work if you're not in a visual medium. When something is like so incomprehensible you can only describe it by what it isn't, where it's like, what I was looking at wasn't a deer, and it's like, ooh, that could mean anything. Yeah. But then you look at it, it's like, it's like a slightly fucked up deer. Okay, whatever. I think that some portrayals of gods kind of need to do the same thing, where you draw on the cosmic horror element of what it means to talk to something so much, not just like bigger than a person, but beyond the scope of anything that could be contained in a person, like storms. What does it mean to embody a storm, or all storms, or something like that? I feel like, I hope there was a point in there somewhere. There are some stories that bring in gods and really highlight, like, yeah, they can maybe pretend to look like a human, but they can't really function like one, just because the time scale is so different, or like, simultaneous, or let's use a good example, Discworld. You can tell when you read Discworld that Terry Pratchett doesn't really think very highly of gods, but he really likes Death, the character, and so all of the interesting elements of what a god could be are brought in through the character of Death, especially in Reaper Man, where they sort of explore, like, what does it actually mean to be Death? He's simultaneously a guy, and he's also all over the world doing his job, and he's also a manifestation of Azazel, the Death of Universes. So what's up with that? And it's just like, yeah, what is up with that? Well, most of the time he's just a guy kind of doing his thing with a job. And, what does it mean to be the granddaughter of a concept like that? What does it mean to be Susan, who's simultaneously human and something a little bit different than human? And the idea that, like, it's not really fully comprehensible, and there are parts of it that will never be comprehensible, but, we can still do our best. I think Terry Pratchett does a good job of capturing, just on the edge of cosmic horror, of just the awareness of a cosmic being, as like, yeah, he's friendly, he works the way you kind of think he will, but you're not really going to be able to get all of him in the picture at once, ever, no matter what angle you take. There are some stories that capture the vibe of a completely inhuman being that still deals with humans on a regular basis, but I think a lot of stories find it easier to just write gods as like people but more. And to their credit, a lot of what we have of Norse mythology kind of gives that vibe. Like Greek gods, a lot of those stories feel kind of vast. It's like, oh, they're fighting Typhon. That's not normal people behavior, you know? Oh, Artemis is mad. She sends a giant killer boar to terrorize the wildlife. That doesn't feel like a superpower. That feels like wrath of a god, sure. But then you get Thor, you know, trading barbs with a boatman for like 30 minutes. And you're like, what are we doing here? Can you not fly? What's happening? So a lot of those stories do feel very, very small scale in a weird way, but they feel kind of folkloric small scale, where, you know, you run into the woods and you might encounter Baba Yaga and she's just vibing, and maybe if you get on her good side, she'll give you a cool gift and send you on your way, or she'll eat you, you know?
One of the two.
Weird shit's out there, but it's very much on the human scale, even though it feels like logically it shouldn't be. Actually, I have identified one specific nitpick, and this will probably be my last point.
Valid.
I think that fantasy writing has made us try to extrapolate hard world building back onto folkloric systems that did not have hard world building because they weren't being built from the ground up as a succinct system that makes sense internally. They were an attempt to make sense of the world. You know, they were an attempt to model the universe of like, yeah, this god rules this thing that's important in our society. This god rules this thing that's important to our society. You know, you follow these rules and you get good results. But we come back at it from like a fantasy world building, like D&D pantheon list of gods perspective, and we're like, you have this domain, and you have this domain, and you have this symbol, and this cool unique character design, and you don't really get that in classic folkloric stories. You know, things just kind of happen, and they may or may not happen in a way that makes sense with the other stories that are happening, but sometimes things just happen, and you just kind of have to deal with it. And I think the temptation to world build hard rules into a system that logically can't have them unless the characters involved have a complete, perfect understanding of the world they live in, I think it's a strong temptation. And I think, well, I guess I keep coming back to there should be more cosmic horror in these stories, because it's like, yeah, leave more unknown so the characters don't fully understand their universe. Ah, dang it. I've just reinvented Eldritch horror from first principles again.
Basically.
But I really think it's cool when you're bringing in stories about these powerful forces beyond moral comprehension. You're kind of going to end up reinventing the concept of Cthulhu from first principles a couple times. And that's fine, you know, nobody has to be mad about that.
I think one thing I keep thinking of when you're describing all this stuff is, and I'm sure you've seen this one because it was pretty big a couple years ago, the Green Knight movie that came out with Dev Patel.
I heard about that. I really haven't watched it yet, but I know it's quite good.
Gotta watch that fucking movie. It's really good.
Yeah. I've heard only good things about it.
Yeah. But it's like one of those things where it's like the aesthetic of the Green Knight, even though that's a spirit, not really a god, he's presented as like whatever. It does that thing that Guillermo del Toro does so often, where the landscape around a thing is an extension of the thing. So you get
a genus loci. That's kind of rare in modern media, but I really like him as a concept.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's again, watch it yourself. You got to see it because it's so cool how they just and they do some things that deviate very strongly from the original story of Sir Gawain, which is interesting. And they play with the ideas and they play with the landscape, and it's neat. It's really cool.
Yeah.
But
I think that more like scary fae, I think, would be a lot of fun. Again, there's the culture, counterculture culture thing that's been going on with fairy, where for initially it's like, oh, fae are like pretty little Victorian paper cutouts. And they're like, actually, the real fae are terrifying, monstrous forces. And it's like, you're both right. They're just kind of everything that's not a person in a classic fairy tale. Sometimes they're the months personified. Sometimes they're Baba Yaga. Sometimes they're the Sluagh in the Wild Hunt. But there's no canon and there's no hard world building, so like everyone yelling that they're the only right one is just you know, it's fine. Yeah. I'm not mad about it.
Things change in adaptation, usually for a very good reason. Maybe it's to appeal to a new demographic. Maybe it's because something didn't work originally. Or maybe because it's hard to translate something directly from the page or the oral tradition to the screen without making a few adjustments here or there. When we are so loyal to the concept of adhering exactly to the text as written, we miss out on opportunities to have some creative input and creative improvements on the narrative as it exists in its form as an adaptation. But online, we sometimes fetishize and over-exaggerate adherence to the letter of the original text, to the point where we get in our own way to tell a good story. And ultimately speaking, all of these films, all of these games, all of these comics exist as, first and foremost, a good story. We can't get in our own way over that. We can't interrupt ourselves as we try to tell good narratives, because we're hung up on a perceived idealized version of a past perfect text.
Despite culture warriors online complaining about us reinterpreting the myths for the modern era, they themselves are working with a mythology that's compromised by modern sensibilities. I don't think they'd really want to see Thor looking as he did in the myth, because we saw how they reacted to the god of war when Thor was depicted in more alignment with the tradition of the poetic Edda. Likewise, I don't think that people would want to see Hercules be this repulsive figure, given how popular Marvel's Hercules is versus how unpopular DC's Hercules is. And that one is more aggressive, less heroic, more violent. These elements are changed because, frankly, it makes for a more satisfying story that we can read. These changes exist for a reason, and we have to understand that as part of the greater tradition of mythology and folklore. How did you get interested in folklore and mythology? What's your background coming into that?
Yeah, so I was immersed in this pretty early on because my dad's idea of bedtime stories were things like the Iliad and the Mahabharata and Lord of the Rings. So I had a Dolores Book of Greek Myths growing up, of course, and like third and fourth grade, we'd like a quarter on that as well. But mostly I was exposed to a lot of like Shakespeare and folk tales and mythology just at home from my parents, which was fun. It was a good way to get a head start on it.
As a father-to-be, that's kind of something I'm playing with my kid to some degree with mythology and folklore. But anyway,
congratulations.
Thank you.